Hi guys, Peace Officer Davey here from Peace Officers UK. So Magna Carta 1215 doesn't exist. Here's why. That's the title of this video. So to understand why it doesn't exist, obviously you need to know a little bit about the history of the time and what the Magna Carta actually was. So the so-called Magna Carta 1215, which everybody was taught at school, I'll get to why I believe everybody was taught that particular version a little bit later. But at the time, you see, I have a keen interest in certain era of history, mainly the Viking era, and that's because I believe I've got potentially Viking heritage, which would probably explain why when I was a very small boy I had bright blonde hair and blue eyes, because I believe I'm from that Scandinavian region originally. My heritage goes back, I'm actually related to the Tudors of Hereford, the House of Tudor, in the 1600s. That's as far as I went back, in as far as genealogy is concerned. I have a keen interest in the Viking era, more specifically I would say from the 9th century, time of Alfred the Great, to the 13th century and the reign of Henry III and Edward I. So let's go back to 1215 and what was happening back in 1215. So the monarch was, of course, King John, who wasn't a very well liked or respected king. He was deemed to be very greedy. Now, King John also ruled lands in northern France, such as Normandy, which come from originally William the Conqueror, William I, and he's obviously inherited these lands too. However, he didn't really spend much time or effort in northern France once he became King of England, and he was king by marriage, as opposed to being a blood relative of William the Conqueror. Prince Louis of France wasn't very happy and decided he was going to take and rule these lands in northern France. And so King John had to defend those lands. Now, King John had some rebels with his barons. There was 25 rebel barons at the time, and who refused to pay the extortionate high taxes that King John introduced in order to fund his campaign in northern France. Because the barons weren't happy, they decided to confront the king, and so they got the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, which was a man called Stephen Langton, who was a cardinal in the Catholic, a cardinal for England in the Catholic Church, who mediated the meeting, in which the 25 rebel barons got King John to sign what was called, not actually Magna Carta, it was called the Great Charter of Liberties. Now, if you take a look at a copy of the original document online, you'll see it's got no title. Okay, I'll get in a short while to where the name Magna Carta comes from. But it was the Great Charter of Liberties, and it was fundamentally based upon the Charter of Liberties of 1100, signed by Henry I upon his ascension to the throne. And it declared certain rights and made the Crown accountable, explained that they had to follow the law. So it was a rehash of the 1100 Charter of Liberties, and it was called the Great Charter of Liberties. Now, it was named in English. If it was, it was written in medieval Latin, because everything was written in medieval Latin at the time. But it wasn't named in Latin. It wasn't spoken about in Latin when referred to. It was referred to as the Great Charter of Liberties. Now, King John wasn't happy that he'd essentially been given no option but to sign the Great Charter of Liberties. In Latin, it would be Magna Carta Libertatum, not just Magna Carta. Magna Carta just means Great Charter, but there's been lots of Great Charters throughout our history. Lots of charters, lots of treaties, etc. So it has a very specific name, Great Charter of Liberties. If you convert that into Latin, it's Magna Carta Libertatum. So King John wasn't happy that he had signed it under duress, and so he approached the Pope Innocent III, and requested that the Pope annul the document, the contract, which Pope Innocent III did approximately 3 weeks after it was signed, which means it also acts retrospectively as if it never existed in the first place. So the following year, 2016, King John died and his son Henry III took the throne. However, Henry III was a boy king. He was only 9 years old, and so he was appointed a regency government, right, that would rule on his behalf for his benefit. So that was in 1216. And so one of the first things they did, actually, I think it was within a matter of weeks, was to re-establish the now defunct document, the Great Charter of Liberties, right? So reissue it as the Great Charter of Liberties 1216. Now, in 1217, the battle with Prince Louis of France was lost by Louis, and so he was forced to sign a peace treaty known as at the time it was known as the Treaty of Lambeth, but was later renamed to the Treaty of Kingston. So because of the confusion with so many charters at the time, there was also another huge charter, which was Charter of the Forest, because in this country at that time 2/3 of the country was forest. So there was a charter just for the forest, and to save confusion with the Great Charter of Liberties and the Charter of the Forest and other charters, Magna Carta 1216, this is in 1217, Magna Carta 1216 was renamed to Magna Carta. Okay. As I say, just to save any confusion with it. Now, they didn't rename Magna Carta 1215 because that had been annulled, which means it doesn't exist. Annulling is like it never happened. Yeah, it's like it never happened, never took place. Although we know the event took place, the document was signed. It's a bit like court proceedings. You know, you go to court, you're found not guilty, you're well, I can't think of the word I'm trying to find, but it's like everything, it's like it never happened. Okay, like you were never involved, nothing happened, you're innocent, and you know, it no longer is a thing. It doesn't stay on your record or anything because it doesn't exist. The charge no longer exists. It disappears. The same could be said for what we were told at school was Magna Carta 1215. Now, in 1225, Henry III, under his own authority, because he was old enough now to take the throne without a regency government, wanted to impose some more taxes, and did so by agreeing to another Magna Carta, a reissuance of the previous version, the 1216 version. Now, what's important to understand about the 1216 version is that when they issued it, okay, because it's not signed under duress, okay, it was issued on behalf of the king as opposed to on behalf of the barons and the king being forced to sign it, which of course is grounds for annulment. Like anybody can get a contract annulled if it's been signed under duress. That's a well-known fact and a well-known right. And that's what happened with King John. So it doesn't exist. Okay, it's like it disappeared into thin air, although it still remains physical copy of it or copies of it. But because it didn't exist, that means that one particular one wasn't renamed to Magna Carta 1215. So and later on there came another Magna Carta that was in 1297 when Edward I took the throne, and that one stood for hundreds of years, until throughout the 19th and 20th century, when pretty much every single element of it had been repealed and replaced by other laws. Now, the 1297 version was a strip, I think it was probably about a third of the size of the original, or certainly of the, I think even of the 1225. Now, what's important about the 1216 version, when it was issued with consent of the Regency government, they had taken out the most controversial issue, which was that the Great Charter of Liberties signed by King John, he was forced to agree to the 25 barons, rebel barons, being able to essentially vote him out of power. Yeah, and it gave them basically the right, so that he had to keep them happy, or they would vote him out and get rid of him and have him replaced. So of course that was taken out, and it was only issued in 1216 because the rebel barons, who were very upset at the fact that the Great Charter of Liberties had been annulled and therefore no longer held any kind of lawful rights, they were very unhappy. So they started showing their support to Prince Louis of France and pledging their allegiance to him. So as a means to win them back, and obviously with the help of the Catholic Church, to convince them, because should they refuse the charter, they could be excommunicated from the Catholic Church for going against God's chosen king, right? So yeah, so I mean, I've heard people teaching about, oh, you know, just write to the barons, and if you can get a certain amount of barons to, you know, that because that was in Magna Carta and it's there in law or whatever. Well, that's not true. That was taken out in 1216 of Magna, what became Magna Carta 1216. Now, as I say, Magna Carta 1215, as we're told. Why are we told that at school? Why are we taught that? And that played on my mind for a long time. And then eventually I thought, well, actually, I suppose it's pretty obvious why, really. Because it's showing you how the legal system essentially was created, right? i.e. Magna Cartas. And by the way, a Magna Carta only lasted for as long as the reign of that particular king. What happened with the 1297 version is it was reaffirmed by every successive monarch after that, right? They chose to reaffirm it because nobody wanted to go pissing off barons who barons controlled, you know, they had their own armies and their own knights, etc. And they were obviously needed for wartime, so they had to keep them reasonably happy, and so each monarch in turn would reaffirm the rights. One of those rights within it that still exists to this day is the City of London and the sovereignty of the City of London. I think there's only 3 things that still remain from the 1297 version. Every other version ended when the king ended. With 1215, it ended the moment it was annulled within a matter of weeks by Pope Innocent III. Okay, so that should be treated like it never existed. Yeah, because technically, legally speaking, it has never existed. As is any like a marriage, it never took. It's like it never took place. If it's been annulled, it's like it never happened, even though physically you know it did happen. You may have attended it, for example. So, why have the schools been teaching this? I believe, and this is just my opinion, I base this on no factual evidence. I believe it's to give you the impression that you have more freedoms and rights than you actually have, or that they grant you, right? That's what I believe, yeah. And of course, it's kind of worked, because so many people I've heard teaching Magna Carta without teaching the history of Magna Carta or the other versions of Magna Carta that came later. And the fact that Magna Carta, as we know it, wasn't called Magna Carta. Yeah, its full name when it was obviously spoken by Pope Innocent III, he referred to it obviously in Latin as Magna Carta Libertatum, right? But the original document was that it was based on was from 1100, called the Charter of Liberties, as I said, under Henry I. And this was essentially a rehash of that, but it gave the barons more power, because obviously the Charter of Liberties only lasted for as long as Henry I did, and it wasn't then reasserted. So I believe that the education system is teaching you about something they know doesn't exist. Yeah. Else why would they teach it? And as I say, I've seen so many people talking about it, teaching it, relying upon it, saying, no, our rights, they've been there for over 800 years and we can stand under the Magna Carta and all this sort of stuff. And what they're standing under is a document that was annulled, essentially, like almost like disappeared into midair, holds no power whatsoever. Yeah. And all the time you're focused on that, on using the Magna Carta. And of course, when you're using or quoting from Magna Carta in court, do you think these judges and magistrates don't know their history when it comes to this? Of course they do. They go to the top schools and universities in the country. Yeah, of course they're taught this stuff. And they're laughing at you. When you use it, they're laughing at you, essentially. What you're doing, if you use Magna Carta in their court system, what you're doing is essentially declaring yourself as a legal illiterate. Okay, you haven't got a clue, you're clueless. You think you know, but you don't. You have a vague idea, but you don't. So when you start quoting Magna Carta, straight in their head, they're probably pissing themselves laughing. They're having a right good giggle. Oh, here we go. We got one of these. He believes that Magna Carta actually exists and actually still holds power, when actually every contract, because that's all it is a contract. Every contract expires when the parties expire. You know, those barons that would have agreed to it, they expired. It didn't hand down to their sons. They were only interested in themselves having that power at the time, and having the power so to make sure that King John did what they wanted him to do, and if he didn't, they had a get out clause. So you need to stop quoting it, relying on it, using it, believing that your rights are based upon it, because they're not. They're not. Your rights can't be based on something that doesn't exist. And it certainly has never held for more than 3 weeks in law. Ever. Never held. Not one element of it has ever held for more than 3 weeks. And after that 3 weeks, when it was annulled, that 3 weeks, it was retrospective. It was retrospectively annulled. So that 3 weeks, it didn't stand legally. Hence the annulment. So I hope that clears things up as far as Magna Carta 1215 and why I say it doesn't exist. So please stop using Magna Carta. Instead, learn the rules of their game. Yeah, the laws are all written down, and they're essentially rules to how to play and win the game. If you refuse to learn those laws, you're not interested. I mean, you don't have to learn them all, because there's many laws that don't apply to you. Okay, find out the ones that do. You know, the Road Traffic Act, if you're a driver, for example. What else? Civil procedure rules, criminal procedure rules. Yeah, read through those and figure out the loopholes that you can use, or the legislations you can use, or the case laws that you can use to defend yourself and defend your legal fiction. And I know a lot of you are being taught to separate yourself from the legal fiction, but I beg you not to do that. I beg you not to do that. Okay, I've had to deal with so many situations, too many to count. Okay, and we're talking in the thousands over the last couple of years, of people who have taken poor advice and, you know, then come to me and go, Davey, this is not working. How do I get out of this? And I have to try, you know, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so, because the damage has already been done. So forget about the common law side of it. These are all ancient laws that can be laughed away by those making the judgments, yeah, and ignored and rejected, and you know, you're essentially telling them that you haven't got the right education to be able to defend yourself, and so therefore it's hard to take anything you say then in the courtroom seriously, you know, because you're classed as illiterate. So learn the laws that protect you, your family, your particular set of circumstances. If you're going out on protests, learn the laws surrounding protests, what they can and can't do. Quite often people get caught out by when they're filming police officers, and police start quoting, you know, saying that they're going to confiscate their camera, their phone, the camera under Section 19 of PACE. Well, learn PACE, because I can tell you Section 19 doesn't give them that power. That only applies in a private property where a police officer is lawfully entitled to be there. So if he's got a search warrant, for example, the search warrant only entitles him to search. It doesn't entitle him to seize anything. And so other powers are required to seize them, to preserve them as evidence. And that's where Section 19 of PACE comes in. But it's often misused. If you learn these rules that apply to you, yeah, everything that could be used against you, maybe at your protest, or not just a protest, but any area, any part of society that you exist within. If you're, as I say, if you're a driver, learn the Road Traffic Act. You know, many people get that wrong. They watch too many American videos where there has to be probable cause to pull you over, but that's not the case in the UK, in England and Wales, the laws of England and Wales, and same in Scotland and no doubt Northern Ireland. That's not the same here under Section 163 and I think Section 164 of the Road Traffic Act. A police officer can pull you over for no reason whatsoever other than to check your documents. But find out what the requirements are, and don't answer their questions, where you go and where have you been, all that sort of stuff, you know, because you could potentially incriminate yourself, even if you've done nothing wrong. So you don't have to do something wrong to incriminate yourself. You can just give them just enough cause for them to be suspicious that you've given them the wrong details, or that you're up to no good, or that you've got, I don't know, you've been drinking, or you've got cannabis in the car. You know, if you're awkward with them, don't be awkward with them, because if you're awkward with them, they would use that. They'll go, I can smell cannabis, knowing full well they can't. But it's good reason to delay you, to put you in handcuffs while they conduct a Section 23 search under the Misuse of Drugs Act, and you know, search your car and see if there's any documentation there and anything, you know, any weapons and all that sort of stuff. So, and all of that can be triggered just by your reaction to them or your arrogance towards them. So just be polite and say, I'm sorry, I don't really want to answer any questions at the moment. Or you can just answer the most basic of questions, you know, if you want to. But don't start using Magna Carta. I have the right to travel, you know, unmolested in my private conveyance, as per Article 60 or 61, is it, of Magna Carta. Seriously, you're making yourself look stupid. Okay, the laws of today are the laws of today. We're stuck in this system, and if you separate yourself as a sovereign being, a living sovereign being, from your legal fiction, then your legal fiction is no longer anything to do with you, right? Which means you need to move out of its house, You need to give back its car. You need to close down its bank account. These all belong to the legal fiction, not the living man or woman. And you are not a named beneficiary as a living man or woman on the birth trust that was created thanks to the Setagavy Act 1666, where all men are deemed, men being the species, are deemed to be beyond the seas after 7 years of being lost at sea. So don't use Magna Carta. It doesn't exist. And even all the other ones that came after it, Magna Carta 2016, Magna Carta 2025, Magna Carta 1297, they no longer stand. Yeah, because as I said, even the most recent of 1297, because Edward I is not still alive, and he was the one that signed it. Yeah, and it's only you know, the monarchs after that, as I said, they did sign, but they've now gone too, and throughout the 19th and 20th century, by which point virtually every element of Magna Carta 1297 had been repealed, and only I think 3 elements exist. So, and none of them are there for your protection. So I hope that helps, bit of a history lesson, and stay safe out there. Take care. Bye-bye.